There was a moment, somewhere around 1978 or 79, when you could walk into a hi-fi shop in any mid-sized American city and feel something in the air that had nothing to do with music. It was closer to competition. Raw, almost industrial competition. The receivers lined up along the back wall weren't just amplifiers anymore, they were statements. And the companies making them had decided, more or less simultaneously, that the only statement worth making was the loudest one possible. What followed was one of the strangest commercial arms races in the history of consumer electronics. And like most arms races, it ended not with a winner, but with a collapse that nobody in the thick of it saw coming. But we'll get to that. First, you have to understand what a receiver even meant to an American household in that era, because the word carries a kind of mundane weight now that it absolutely did not carry then. A receiver was the center of your universe. It was the tuner, the preamplifier, and the power amplifier all fused into one chassis, one glowing, warm-running slab of Japanese engineering that sat on a shelf or a dedicated rack and told everyone who walked through your front door exactly who you were. The dial lit up amber or green. The needles on the VU meters swung with a physical authority that felt almost biological. You could feel the heat rising off the top vent after an hour of play. These machines had mass, had presence, had consequence. Through the early and middle part of the 1970s, the Japanese manufacturers, Pioneer, Sansui, Technics, Marantz, Kenwood, had been steadily escalating receiver power. This was partly engineering progress, partly genuine consumer demand as speakers became more ambitious and rooms got larger, and partly something more primal than either of those things. It was ego. Corporate ego translated directly into watts per channel, printed in bold numerals on a brushed aluminum faceplate and argued about in showroom fluorescent light by men in leisure suits who absolutely knew what they were talking about, and also absolutely did not. The benchmark kept moving. 30 watts per channel became 50. 50 became 100. 100 became 120. And somewhere in that progression, the equipment crossed a line from tool to trophy, and the race became something else entirely. Pioneer fired what most historians of the era consider the opening shot of the monster receiver period with the SX-980, released in 1976. 100 watts per channel into 8 ohms, a chassis that weighed just over 43 pounds, and a faceplate so wide and architecturally serious that placing it on a standard shelf required a moment of planning. It sold well. It looked remarkable. But more importantly, it told every other manufacturer in the market that the game had changed and the rules were gone. Sansui answered. Kenwood answered. Technics, the electronics division of Matsushita, answered with particular aggression. But Pioneer was already climbing. The SX-1250 came next, then the SX-1580, and then in 1978, Pioneer released something that the audio press essentially ran out of adequate adjectives to describe, the SX-1980. 270 watts per channel. A chassis that weighed just a hair under 66 pounds. A front panel so wide that it measured approximately 22 inches across and required a dedicated equipment rack to house properly. The power supply alone was engineering theater, a transformer of a scale that belonged in commercial broadcast equipment, not a living room in Akron or Sacramento or suburban Atlanta. Pioneer priced it at over $1,000 at retail, which in 1978 dollars was a figure that required genuine commitment to the purchase. Dealers reported that customers would come in specifically to lift it, the way people squeeze a melon at a market to confirm what they already believe. The showroom experience around these machines deserves its own moment, because it was genuinely unlike anything the consumer electronics world had produced before or has produced since. Hi-Fi dealers in the late 70s were a specific American institution, small shops, usually, run by enthusiasts who had crossed the line into commerce without fully leaving enthusiasm behind. The listening rooms in the back had carpet on the walls. The speakers were large enough to be furniture. When a salesman dialed up a flagship receiver into a pair of floor-standing speakers and let something, anything, play at reference levels, the sound pressure was not metaphorically impressive. It was physically impressive. People felt it in their chests. It was a sensory argument that closed sales. Sansui understood this perfectly. The G-series receivers that Sansui built during this period represent perhaps the most extreme expression of the philosophy, the idea that a receiver should command a room before a single note plays, purely through its visual and physical authority. The G22000 and the G33000, released in the late 70s, were objects that straddled the line between electronics and sculpture. The G33,000 delivered a claimed output of 220 watts per channel, with a build quality, the feel of the controls, the smoothness of the tuning mechanism, the solidity of the binding posts, that remains difficult to describe without sounding like you're exaggerating. Those machines were assembled with a seriousness that suggested the engineers involved were doing something they considered important. Because they did consider it important. The faceplate on a top-tier Sansui from this era has a particular quality in your hands. The aluminum is thick enough to feel structural rather than cosmetic. The knobs have a mechanical resistance that communicates precision without communicating effort. If you close your eyes and work the controls on something like a G9000 or a G22,000, there is a haptic satisfaction that modern equipment, assembled to price points, designed for obsolescence, simply does not replicate. These are machines that were built to outlive the decade. Most of them did. Many of them are still running. Technics, meanwhile, was taking a slightly different angle on the same obsession. Where Pioneer leaned into sheer power and Sansui into build density and aesthetic gravity, Technics invested in the idea of technical legitimacy. The SA-series receivers from the late 70s featured innovations in circuit topology that the engineering team clearly wanted the consumer to understand, even partially, because understanding them was part of the value. The SA-1000 was a flagship that spoke in a language of specifications, distortion figures, signal-to-noise ratios, damping factors that rewarded the kind of buyer who read specification sheets the way other people read novels. Kenwood competed. Marantz competed, though Marantz by this point was navigating a complicated corporate transition that was introducing its own kind of friction into the product pipeline. But the real problem was already inside the industry at large, growing quietly while the wattage numbers climbed. It is worth pausing here to note something that the showroom experience of the era tended to obscure: almost no one needed 270 watts per channel for home listening. The physics of this are not complicated. 100 watts into an efficient speaker in a typical living room is enough to produce sound pressure levels that are genuinely dangerous to human hearing over extended periods. The jump from 100 watts to 270 watts is, in logarithmic terms, less than 5 decibels of potential headroom. That is a real engineering difference, but it is not a difference a listener would reliably identify in a blind test at normal listening volumes. The monster receiver was, in the most precise sense, a confidence object. It was purchased to be owned, to communicate something about its owner, to sit in the den and glow with the amber certainty of a machine that could do far more than would ever be asked of it. This is not a criticism. This is, in fact, the most human thing imaginable. But the market dynamics that made it possible were beginning to shift, and shift in ways the manufacturers were not positioned to detect clearly from the inside. The first pressure was economic, and it was blunt. The energy crisis of the middle and late 70s had a delayed but real effect on the consumer relationship with large, power-hungry electronics. A monster receiver at idle was not an energy-efficient object. Regulatory conversations about consumer electronics and power consumption were beginning in several markets. More practically, the cost of electricity was on the mind of American consumers in a way that it had not been a decade earlier, and a machine that ran warm to the touch, that required ventilation, that drew power in ways that were visible on a utility bill, that machine began to carry a slightly different cultural valence than it had in 1975. The second pressure was demographic, and it arrived wrapped in something that looked, at first, like just another product. Sony introduced the Walkman in 1979, initially in Japan and shortly after in the American market. The Walkman was not, technically, a hi-fi product. Its frequency response was limited, its output power was measured in milliwatts rather than watts, its listening experience was fundamentally private rather than social. And yet it represented a complete inversion of every value that the monster receiver stood for. Music became portable. Music became personal. Music became something you carried in your pocket rather than something anchored to a shelf in a dedicated room. This matters not because the Walkman immediately killed the monster receiver, it did not overnight, but because it revealed that a significant portion of the market, particularly younger buyers who might have been the next generation of serious hi-fi consumers, were developing a fundamentally different relationship with recorded sound. They were not thinking about watts per channel and binding post quality and the weight of a faceplate. They were thinking about a cassette in a jacket pocket and foam headphones and the particular freedom of listening while moving through the world. The hi-fi industry's response to this was slower than it should have been, and the reasons for that slowness are worth understanding. Companies like Pioneer and Sansui and Technics had spent the latter half of the 70s in an engineering and marketing posture that was oriented entirely toward escalation. Their best engineers were working on bigger transformers, lower distortion figures, more impressive chassis. Their marketing was built around the language of supremacy. The organizational momentum pointed in one direction, and organizational momentum, especially inside manufacturing companies with long product development cycles, does not pivot quickly. So the monster receivers kept coming for a few more years. The specifications kept climbing on paper even as the market for them began quietly contracting. Pioneer released updates. Sansui produced the G33,000 as if to make the definitive statement and dare anyone to answer. Technics continued refining. And then the early 1980s arrived, and with them a set of forces that were decisive. Consumer electronics began moving toward separates, a distinct amplifier, a distinct preamplifier, a distinct tuner, among the serious audiophile segment. This market, which had always existed alongside the receiver market, grew as a proportion of hi-fi spending as the broader market softened. The buyers who wanted to spend serious money increasingly wanted components, not an all-in-one chassis. The buyers who did not want to spend serious money increasingly wanted compact systems, or portable systems, or systems that fit inside an apartment that was smaller than the house in the suburbs their parents had built a dedicated listening room into. The monster receiver occupied a middle ground that was eroding from both directions simultaneously. Dealer networks, which had been the beating heart of the hi-fi industry's retail presence, began to struggle. The listening rooms with carpet on the walls became less common. Mass-market retailers, electronics chains, department stores, were not equipped to sell a 66-pound receiver the way a dedicated hi-fi shop could. You cannot convey what the SX-1980 is through a price tag on a shelf peg. You need a room, a pair of speakers, enough floor space to run it properly, and a salesman who cares. That infrastructure was expensive to maintain and increasingly difficult to justify as foot traffic declined. The final irony, and it is a genuine one, is that the monster receivers were extraordinarily well built. The engineering inside a late 70s flagship Sansui or Pioneer was not inflated by marketing. The components were selected for longevity, the assembly was meticulous, and the machines were designed to actually run, producing actual power, for decades. They were built for a relationship with a consumer that was expected to last 20 years. The market dissolved around them before that relationship could fully form. Machines rated for 20,000 hours of use found themselves in storage rooms and eventually in the second-hand market before their original owners were finished with them. Today you can find a Pioneer SX-1980 for somewhere between $500 and $1,500 depending on its condition, which is a price that feels both surprising and entirely appropriate. The serious vintage market has recognized what these machines are. They require recapping, the electrolytic capacitors inside age regardless of use, and a 45-year-old receiver needs fresh components to perform as designed, but properly restored examples do what their specifications claim. The 270 watts is real. The build quality that you can feel through the controls is real. The weight, when you lift it, is an honest weight. The lesson the receiver wars leave behind is not that excess is always punished, though sometimes it is. The lesson is more specific than that. Markets are made of people, and people's relationships with objects change in ways that are genuinely difficult to predict from inside a manufacturing culture. Sansui and Pioneer were not wrong to build what they built. They were building what the market, in that specific cultural moment, was asking for. The moment changed. The machines outlasted it. There is something almost tender about a monster receiver sitting in a den in 1982, still warm, still glowing amber, while the family's teenager listens to a Walkman in another room entirely. Two different relationships with music. Two different centuries, almost. The practical takeaway, if you are looking for one, if you find a properly restored SX-1980 or a Sansui G-series receiver in good condition, the price you will pay today buys you an object that was built to a standard of material honesty that the current market simply does not offer at any consumer price point. These machines were never cheap to make. They are still not cheap to find. They are worth what they cost. If this history of objects and the people who built them is the kind of thing that keeps you up at night, in the best possible way, you know what to do. And if you find yourself wondering